I think right now is a really good time to think about poetry, because the things happening in the world, they feel so big, they feel so overwhelming. They're like my body cannot contain the feelings that I feel at this time, the panic, the worry, the anxiety, the distress, the trappedness and the frustration.
Thank you very much for being part of the Poetry.LA Interview Series. We met in 2018 at the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing. You were part of the faculty. You have an MFA from the University of New Mexico. You are the Associate Director of Writing at the University of California Merced. And you have published poetry, also fiction and creative nonfiction.
Poetry came much later for me. I started as a fiction writer and believed myself a fiction writer. I used to have conversations with people, arguments, in my MFA program about why fiction was the better genre, back in these early, younger, dumber days, and I think the thing about poetry was that it came to me much later. And it also came to me through my wife, who loves poetry. And, as I think about it, and I've told this story a lot to my students, I didn't like poetry because the poets that I had been exposed to when I was in school were all of these very old, 18th century poets. I was an English major at UC Berkeley. And, while I could understand the intellectual beauty of those older poems, there was nothing that resonated at a personal level for me. And it wasn't until much later, when I was exposed to contemporary poets, that I recognized oh, these poems are actually speaking to me. There was a collection that somebody gave me by Jax Mcnamara, a queer poet who was in San Francisco and in Santa Fe. And I felt like when I read that collection of poems, I understood for the first time why someone would write and read poetry. And my wife, she taught me, she used to say, I would say, I don't understand how to read poetry. And she was like, well, the problem is you're trying to understand how to read poetry. You're not supposed to understand it, right? That's what you're trained to do in school, is you're trained to think of poems like some puzzle that some smart kid in a lecture hall is able to say wise things to the professor. And it had this texture that felt like I was always out of the knowing about understanding something. And it wasn't until I experienced poem in an experiential way that I began to really love it.
I have selected a poem called Baptism for the Living that was published in 2019 in a magazine called Dove Coat.
Baptism for the Living. And it begins with one of those quotes at the beginning. If you don't break your ropes when you're alive, do you think ghosts will do it after? It's by Kabir. And isn't that the opposite of how we usually talk of inheritance? Child as possibility, child as hope. That little baby, a bundle of her mother's unfinished self. Is it any wonder my wife would rather feed hawks than share her womb, lest she lose a part of herself to another being's hunger? It isn't that baby's fault that she was that baby once. Baby as transference, baby as obstacle, baby as all it can never possibly be. Better then that we are guided by ghosts who can tie or break or bind invisibly. Better that we cannot see the woman undoing the ropes while we sleep. Better that one morning we simply wake to the bruises. We roll our wrists, we ache, we open our hands, and just like that, without us knowing, we're free.
In this poem, Baptism for the Living, I feel like we enter the territory, well, we enter many territories, but we enter the territory of childhood. And I would like to go back to your childhood a little bit to see if you can share your first memories of how you encountered literature or the arts, if you were in a family that paid special attention to storytelling or reading?
My earliest memories of reading are my brother reading to me like one of those Berenstain books, the ABC types of stories. My older brother, he was reading them to me, and I think in hindsight, he was probably showing off that he could read them to me, or like mimicking something that happened, with my parents. But that reading to a sibling became a theme. Like I remember reading Huckleberry Finn to my sister, or like Tom Sawyer to my sister, one of those like Mark Twain types of books. I really loved Abraham Lincoln when I was a grade schooler. I don't know how that happened, like I think it was the beard and the hat. Like, I didn't have any of the today's logic about why. It was one of those do a report. And he used to sit on a fence post and read aloud to practice reading aloud. And there was something in the young me that really loved that idea. So I would read. And what I've learned later, my wife and I still do that. We still read to each other. We take a lot of road trips. And one of the things that we often do is we bring like tome types of books, like short story collections or poetry collections. And then whoever's driving, the other person reads to them. And I find like that there's, I think there's many ways to experience a book, but the reading a book to someone, especially, we do it as kids, but we don't really do it as adults. But there's that shared experience of like journeying through a story that's usually very private and intimate, that when you're reading it to somebody, you're taking it together. And, I think I'm realizing at this moment in time that this is something I've done my whole life. And it's also now something I do in my marriage.
It's not connected to this image of reading to each other, but I somehow these memories of our time in the Martha's Vineyard Writing Institute, we were talking about the writing process, and I think you talk about the inner critic, and somebody said that sometimes the inner critic is like a parent that is protecting you. But sometimes the inner critic is very paralyzing. So you have a lot of experience teaching creative writing. I would like you to address a little bit how do you deal with the inner critic?
Yeah, actually, that was Christopher Citro is the one who mentioned about the inner critic.
Oh, okay.
But I love that you brought that up, because that's actually his words on the inner critic are something I talk to my students about quite a bit. That what he said was that the inner critic talks and talks and talks and talks, and he doesn't try to argue with the inner critic. He said he just says, yeah, you're right, but I'm going to write anyway. And then he says eventually the inner critic gets tired. I think it's really funny, but this quarantine time for a lot of people has been very difficult to write. Some people I've talked to have had a great time writing. Most writers I know have had a lot of struggle. And I think part of it is the silence that we're in. And when we're in that much kind of isolation and silence, I think, at least for me, there's a reason I go to coffee shops to write, is because that's like, I've trained my brain to go there and do that. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of sound, and then that's what I do. And it feels very special. There's a treat involved with it. I have a nice aesthetic with it. I like staring at the artwork on the walls. But right now we don't, people like me that write like that, we don't have that. And so that inner critic voice is so loud. And it's also saying things like, you should be writing right now. Like, what are you doing? You can't travel. You can't go anywhere. You have all this time. Like, you watch Netflix for hours. Like, why can't you write for hours, right? So I channeled Christopher Citro the other day. I've been working on this collection that I've been like kind of putting some final touches on. In that last little chunk of time, it was like, that's when the voices come in that start saying, this is terrible. Nobody's going to read this book. You just spent like how many years on this manuscript? And it's like, I could feel it. I could feel like you just have 1 or 2 more days of just like finishing the order, making sure they're right, reading through it, and I actually did the Christopher Citro thing. I sat down and I wrote in a journal on pages that are meant to be thrown away. This was from another writer, Satine Phoenix, told me this. If you write it down, nobody's going to read it, and then you can just throw it away after. And I wrote all of the things that the inner critic was telling me about how awful I was, and how I was a fraud, and how everyone would see through it. And it was the most amazing thing, because I wrote it I pushed it aside, and then I felt fine to work again. It was like, he really did have a logic there that if you try to shut it down, it's like a person who just keeps interrupting, like wanting to be heard. But you just acknowledge it, and then you just write anyway. And then it's, as he said, it grows tired. So I love that you brought that up.
Let's hear two more poems that I have selected. One is called, I hope I pronounced this properly, The Limclean State Park 2. It was published in 2016. And the other one is called Pinacook Avenue, that was published in The Camp in 2018.
At the Limekiln State Park 2. The drive from Rock City, New Mexico to the Chicaraja forests in southern Arizona takes 4 hours if you don't stop for coffee in Silver City. Timing, you see, is everything. Once upon a time, a man decided the best way to find copper was to tear the mountains to dust so towns could be built in the rubble. But don't worry, the sign says. The reclamation started in 1986, and who cares if this wound lasts 1,000 years? Look at this poor mining town that has since disappeared. In historic Silver, the art store boasts real copper wares, and we feel like our skin has been stripped from our skin. In the park, we rest on memorial benches. I say, not a bad place to spread your ashes. You say, I prefer something more dramatic than this. And the other poem was in decomp, and that's at Penicook Avenue. It could have been the tick bite, imaginary though it was, that pressed the bullseye to my chest, or the raw wound on the underside of my left breast, or the man on the airplane who looked me in the eye and said, I don't care what you have between your legs, I still want to kill you, and how we both knew he meant it. Or the way we sat, eyes closed, clutching hands as the plane dropped the earth shadow so dark and so low it made to swallow the plane whole. Sarah tells how the morning after the election, she woke to paint tiny black squares, each one a camera slice of slightly differing sky. I wake the next morning to stand at the open window, acutely aware of the tiny black squares lined inside the cavity of my chest, waiting as she did on the promise of sun.
After listening these poems, and also after reading other poems that you have published, there is a theme that I think reappears. To me, this is just from my perception, the theme of being invaded, or a certain level of aggression, or a certain level of struggle. Something like something is kind of invading, or is dangerous outside. And then when I visited your website and you talk about yourself, you say that you struggle with what it means to be a queer person of color living in a world where it is becoming increasingly difficult to exist as a queer person of color without writing about it. Could you expand this a little bit, and maybe also connect it to the poems you have read?
Alexander Weinstein, he and I one morning, this was one of the most important conversations I had in the last 4 years or so, and this is tied to the person of color thing. Yeah. So he writes, if viewers don't know his work, he writes a sci-fi, dark, futuristic, but if technology kind of took over in ways that we don't want it to. And so I was talking to him about what felt like a struggle was that whenever somebody said, oh, here's a queer poet of color, and then they would get this poem about a hike, like the one that I read, it felt like people would be disappointed, like, oh, I was expecting you to write about your identity. And so I said to him, imagine what that would be like, Alexander, if every time you sat down to write one of your stories, your futuristic stories, you had to treat your character's whiteness on the page. And you had to write about your character's whiteness. And he just looked at me and he was like, that would really suck. And I was like, yeah, and that's how it feels. It feels like, you know, and so it felt like I felt a big push-pull. And then the election happened, and then it turned into not a push-pull. It felt like a responsibility to like lean into a self that that I didn't usually put on the page. So my identity was never, for me, about struggle, right? And I think that's what's happening now, is I think identity is a struggle. Like if you don't, if you look like somebody different, it's a struggle. I keep thinking of those stories post-elections of like an Asian woman at a gas station and somebody harassing them, and like other people having to step in, and like people like hugging each other and crying because they were getting harassed just for the ways that they look. And we're seeing that with the coronavirus, and we're seeing that with how the response to things are happening. So if you take like, you know, here's where the intersectionality comes in this work is, you know, there's Filipino writers, there's queer writers, and then I've always been in Latino communities like most of my life. And so then there's Latino literature, which is like my first like real love of literature came with Latino literature. It was like part of my undergrad studies. And then for me, it was also like Asian American literature. And I would find myself having to triangulate through all of these types of literatures, and I would read these and I would try to put myself in there somehow, like where am I in these works. And so, you know, and it's been this has like been the journey of this collection, was the understanding that, oh, you have things to say about yourself, but you just haven't known how to write this because it's too many fragments. So I would try to write a Filipino poem, and it would feel fake. It would feel false, you know? Or, you know, and also because I don't have the Filipino language, I have like little bits of it. And my dad passed when I was 20, and he's the one who, his family is still in the Philippines. So when he was alive, we went there all the time. And my writing like really launched when I was 20, which was almost 20 years ago. So I've never gone to the Philippines as a writer. I've only gone to the Philippines in the days before I owned that identity. And so, I mean, that's, I think, one of my like post-quarantine goals, is to like spend some time there. Because I feel like you can't, like if you're missing that language piece, and you're living, like I'm living in a place with, you know, it's Central Valley, California.
The last series of poems I have read by you, it's a collection of studies in color, of course, with all the connotations that color has. So you have a study in cerulean, a study in white, a study in brown, a study in yellow, a study in black. Could you talk a little bit about the origin of this series? And then I would like you to read the study in yellow.
The series came about, so I did a year ago, almost to the day, I did a residency. It's at the MassMOCA. It's my favorite museum in the country. It's massive, large-scale contemporary art. The museum is in an old sawmill. So I would write in the morning, and then in the afternoons I would walk through this museum. And there was this one exhibit by James Turrell. Basically, he works in light. Light is his medium. And so there was one exhibit that was a room that was completely white. And you would walk in, and they would put these like color fuses that were in it. And what it would feel like is that you were walking through color. And there next door was one that was called Hindsight. And you would walk, and you'd have to follow this railing because it was pitch black. So you'd follow the railing, you would grope around, you would find the seat. You had to have an appointment because otherwise you would step on each other. And you would find your seat, which felt like this little throne, and you would sit in a pitch black room. And then after, you'd have to stay there for at least 10 minutes. And then after a while, this light would appear, just barely, just like the kind of, you know, little glimmer. And I would go every day. It was like going to church for me. I would go to these two pieces. You know, one of the other artists that was there with me, she was saying, her name's Lauren Davies. She said, yeah, I love James Turrell, but, you know, given what's happening in the world, it just feels like, it's pretty, right? Like it, like her kind of comment was, and so I thought about that a lot. And that's where the first two that really came out was Study in White and Study in Black. And one was about the room with the color. And then the Study in Black was the room that was essentially a box. And then there was another piece that I loved by Rafa Esparza. He's a LA artist, yeah, and his piece was called "We Are the Mountains," and he turned the walls, like he would put adobe on the walls in the museum, and it had adobe floors, and and he would paint on the adobe, and his was another one that I visited a lot, and so Study in Brown came from that piece, and then it was the rest of them kind of came through it. I mean, the Study in Yellow was like an obvious, like, okay, like you're still, again, like talking about identity, like where do I fit in, and how do I kind of fit into that? Like I was like, well, people are technically, you're yellow, technically Filipinos are Asian, even though I think Filipinos have a lot more in common with Latinos than they do with Chinese or Japanese or Korean or other kind of Asian folks. Like, again, it's a blending of where do you fit. And so it, Study in Yellow came after that. And then the Study in Rainbow was like, okay, well, there's a queer sense. How do I, so this was my attempt to sit with those, but it was not as conscious as I'm making it sound. It was like these all came out almost in one breath, at least the first drafts of them. It was like I Study in White and Study in Black kind of came out, and then the rest of them, it just felt like one, like they'd been wanting to come out, and then it was shaping them, like then knowing what I had, then shaping them into that.
Let's hear Study in Yellow.
Study in Yellow. Here's how you understand the sun. Sit in a sandbox with a box of crayons. Search for a color that matches your skin. Remember the kid speaking Japanese and the way you joined in. Remember how you pulled your eyes squint, how you laughed. Read Amy Tan, then read her again. Read Sandra Cisneros, then read her again. Hold the books to the light and hope you blend in. When the young woman tells you, this whole time I thought you were Mexican, remind her how you were colonized by the same people. Pretend this makes you kin. One day, outside the empty restaurant, you'll hear the song of your father's tongue. Hold the melody in your mouth and look to the sky. Think of mango trees and sugared tamarind. Feel monsoon season coming with the wind.
It's such a beautiful piece. I think it's very daring. It's powerful, but it's a softness, a vulnerability. I love this collection. Is any of this published?
So this one just came out in Emory's journal. Was this one, and all of these are like my most recent publications. The Study in White and Study in Black, they are in tri-quarterly, and then Study in Brown is a piece that's that one eluded me for a long time. So I've just finished the revisions of that, and I sent it out, I think this past weekend. I literally sent that one out, and that line, like, hope you blend in, like, it's something I've been talking about. Like that's the collection's title, is Hope You Blend In. And with this kind of, a lot of my work is responding to artwork as well, so I think that's kind of fitting. Yeah.
I always like to close the interviews, asking the poet to select one poem, just to be like the last piece that we hear to close the interview. So what have you selected?
I thought it would make sense to just read Study in Brown, because to me, Study in Yellow and Study in Brown, they're a partner. Like Study in White and Black, those are a partner. And so if Study in Yellow was the one, then Study in Brown feels like the other.
Wonderful. Okay. Wonderful.
And it's also the one I finished last, and I always like to read something brand new. So here's Steady and Brown. And again, this was after Rafa Esparza's exhibit, Staring at the Sun, and he had a piece called We Are the Mountain. Here is how you understand the land. Return to the Midwest after 10 years in the desert. Say my body is shifting tectonic plates, promise of mountains rising from the earth's warm back. When the librarian asks, how did you end up here? Remember how they told you to check your roster for foreign sounding names, how they said, make sure your students are in the right place. Think of place. Think of islands. Think of your father's hands. Think of mahjong on soft cloth, of duck eggs and Spanish bread. Think of longanisa and of laughter, of Leia Salonga, of your grandmother in the kitchen making bola bola. Think of meatballs, of highballs and San Miguel beer. Think of your grandmother's blue eyes, her Spanish blood. Think of clay, of the dry crack of dry land, of rivers dammed. Think of Mexico and New Mexico. Think of Spain. Think of the man promising, I shall return. Think of the mighty pen, of your grandfather returning to Minnesota to find his wife carrying another man's child, of his signing up for a second tour. Think of the young woman in the classroom who said, this whole time, I thought we were born from the same dry roots. Think of kinship. Think of rain. Think of driving through the reservation in the middle of summer, how your friend with the skin the color of Cambodia returned to the car and said, I wonder if this is how white people are treated everywhere. In the morning, wake to a sky gaping like a wound. Say my body is shifting tectonic plates. Promise of mountains rising from the earth's warm back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.